BU with an English bachelor's degree and completed a PhD at the University of Washington, Seattle. She is currently part of the English department here, and she is the author of The Peculiar Afterlife of Slavery, the minstrel form and Chinese worker in American literature. Her main research is within Asian American and African American studies. Please welcome Caroline Yang.
Sorry for the racist image to start the talk. So thank you everybody for being here. Good evening. This is not supposed to be the first image. I guess Lily got the... No, it's okay. It's not your fault. So thank you so much for inviting me to this beautiful dinner, student-organized dinner. I'm so greatly honored to be here. Thank you to Lily for inviting me to be the speaker tonight. And thank you all of you for being here on not so... one of the most stressful times in the semester. So congratulations to all of you for being here, for taking the time out to take a break, and to all the organizations who put this together. I'm very honored and proud to be here and sharing this space with you. So I want to start with a few questions so that it can be audience participatory. How many of you would identify yourselves as Asian or Asian American? So quite a few of you. Keep your hands up. So of those of you who have your hands up, do you know when the term Asian American was coined?
68, 5.
Good job. Yes, 1968. Nice work. No prize, yeah, but you get the recognition. But keep your hands up one more time. So those of you who identify as Asian or Asian American, how many of you have relatives who lived in the United States before 1968, when the term was first coined? Do you see how many hands are still up? Not very many, right? Very few. So almost everybody raised their hands for the first question, but there are very few people whose hands are still up. So given that number of the people who have their hands up, it's not surprising that many of us didn't know when the term Asian American was first coined, and it's not surprising that many of us might not be aware of the history of Asian Americans in the United States. People like me personally, I don't have a personal connection to that. Many Asians living in the United States today are immigrants, recent immigrants themselves, or children of immigrants. So people might not have a personal connection to the history of the 1960s. So in my talk today, I want to very briefly go over maybe an explanation for this phenomenon and think about kind of our course of action in response. So first, the question is, why are so many Asian people in the United States immigrants? Why is that? Why is it that many Asian people don't have ancestors in the United States prior to the 1960s? This image is kind of an answer to that question, right? Before 1965, there were laws in the United States that barred Asians from entering the country. Before 1965, it was illegal for Asians to immigrate to the United States. So it's not just a coincidence that Asian Americans don't have this kind of long heritage. So many people think that Asians are kind of recent immigrants, right? That Asian people don't have a long history in the United States, which is not true. Asian Americans or Asians have been in the United States for much longer than before 1965, right? Many Chinese workers came to work on the gold mines in California in 1850s. And worked on the railroads in California as well. There were Filipino workers who came to work on the farms. And so we have a long history, but that history has been sort of forgotten because when Asian workers came to the United States, they were vilified as antithetical to anything that was American. They were seen as subhuman, right? You can see by this rat poison that depicts a Chinese man as eating rats, right? So this kind of anti-Chinese campaign was rampant in the 19th century, which eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that specifically said Chinese workers could not enter the country. And this kind of political cartoon depicting, again, Chinese workers as a threat to Americans, but specifically in this case to white American women, this kind of image was very rampant. So these kind of cultural discrimination or cultural representations of Asians kind of coexisted with legal exclusions of Asians, right? They were kind of mirrored in the laws against Asians from entering the country. So there were like strings of anti-Asian immigration laws. So not just the Chinese Exclusion Act, but other Asians were vilified and excluded as well following that. In 1917, the U.S. actually created this thing called the Asiatic Bar Zone. That's just said like everybody from this zone can't come to the United States, right? And all of this kind of culminated in the 1924 Immigration Act, which was the most strict and stringent immigration act of its kind. It created a national quota for people to enter the country, and it was really designed to stop Asian immigration altogether. So we see this kind of cultural and legal exclusion of Asians in the United States prior to the 1960s. But this kind of work that Asians did is something that we still see traces of, right? So this is a picture of Chinese mine workers working in the California gold mines. The work and the labor of Asians in the United States have been indispensable to kind of building up this nation, as has been the labor of many people of color, right? You can see this picture of like celebrating the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which would not have been possible without the work of the Chinese workers. But the Chinese workers were explicitly told not to get in this picture. So I don't know if you can see, but it's mostly white workers, mostly Irish workers, but the Chinese workers were told, don't get in. So we don't have that celebratory moment, right? So this kind of exclusion is kind of part and parcel of the cultural exclusion of Asians in the United States. But we see kind of a trace of Chinese labor and Asian labor. And let me show you this clip as an example. So this is from a show called Password. I don't think
We'll start with you this time.
this exists.
Got it? Maddie? We'll look at the word, of course.
The password is laundry.
10 points, Yuri.
Chinese
Laundry.
Yes!
Do you get that? So the password is laundry, and this woman has to guess. She's
Really got 10
the partner
points,
of
right?
Gregory
10
Peck.
to 7. By the way,
Oh, yeah, we don't want to play the whole clip. So she has to guess the password associated with laundry, right? So meaning the word most associated with laundry in the 1960s was Chinese. And there's even a shoe brand that exists today called Chinese Laundry, right? And that's because Chinese laundry workers and Chinese laundry shops were very prevalent in the United States, as they are still sort of today, right? So even though Chinese labor has been excluded culturally and legally, we see kind of a trace of this, right, in this kind of popular cultural representation. So the other question that I want to address here is what my question earlier about when the term Asian American was first coined. So what's your name? Gandhi's correctly answered that it was 1968, right? So 1968 also refers to this like kind of revolutionary moment that Lily was referring to earlier about Asian American activism. So this is APA, Asian American Pacific Political Alliance at UC Berkeley, which is kind of a mirror or sister of ASA here, right? So the Asian American Political Alliance was created in 1968 as part of this kind of political activism of students and community activists who fought for ethnic studies as a space within the university. So they were kind of, these activists were calling for a reclaiming of our histories and our cultures, right? They were asking for Asian American history classes to be taught, Asian American literature classes to be taught, and one of the activists is the one who actually coined the term Asian American. This was, you know, we might just take the term Asian American for granted, but this in the 60s, it was really radical to say that Asians are American. This is not radical today, right, for us to be like, oh yeah, American. But back in the 1960s, when Asians were considered like aliens, they were all kind of lumped together as Chinese or Orientals, right, which is an outdated and derogatory term. But these activists said, we are not that, we are Asian American. So it was a kind of an active claiming of identity. And this identity was articulated alongside not just Asian American activists, but also other activists of color. So the Asian American Political Alliance joined forces with the Third World Liberation Front at the San Francisco State University to engage in one of the longest running student strikes. And you can see on the left a picture of an Asian American activist and who joined forces with the Black Student Union, Latin American Student Organization, Native American Student Organization. There was a Filipino student organization as well that joined forces. And these activists were not just calling for kind of a domestic space within the university, but they were also critical of the role of the United States abroad. So they were critical of particularly the U.S. presence in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So you can kind of see that from the name that they chose for themselves, the Third World Liberation Front, which is similar to the name of the North Vietnamese army that was more familiarly called the Viet Cong. So they saw themselves kind of in alliance with the Vietnamese who were calling for the United States to leave Vietnam. So the Third World Liberation Front was also influenced by the Black Power movement of the 1960s. The Black Power movement is sort of should be distinguished from the kind of the mainstream civil rights movement. Black Power movement was advocating for self-empowerment and self-protection of the Black communities. So you can see on the left the founders of the Black Panther Party, which began in Oakland, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, and also Kathleen Cleaver among the Panthers. So the Black Panther Party had, if you ever look up their 10-point system, it's really remarkable. They had a 10-point system that kind of called for very specific remedies for taking back the street. And they were really kind of advocating for advocating against police brutality, police violence, kind of state violence against Black lives. And this is the influence that the Asian American Student Union or student activists were kind of working alongside. You can also see that there were kind of like specific radical Asian Americans in these groups. You can see Richard Aoki on the left, who was friends with Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and who was actually part of the Black Panther Party. And our own Yuri Kochiyama was also involved in the She was involved in the Black Power movement on the East Coast, whereas Richard Aoki was more involved on the West Coast. So Yuri Kochiyama was friends with Malcolm X, and we saw this in the video of Yuri Kochiyama that we saw. If you've ever seen a picture of Malcolm X when he was assassinated in 1965, there's a woman cradling his head as he's bleeding to death, and that woman was actually Yuri Kochiyama. So it's something kind of worth thinking about, that many people don't know that. And that's like, something that's documented in a photograph, but even that photograph's history is something that we might not really know. So we have to kind of remember that past and remember this revolutionary woman that was Yuri Kochiyama. And I think that we are the only college campus in the United States who has a cultural center named Yuri Kochiyama. So it's really a point of pride. And I think Lily really spoke so eloquently about the need to preserve this space, right, for student work and for student support, and kind of preserve the legacy of her activism. So this is our radical past. These are our radical ancestors. But many of us don't know it. And many of us don't really think that the Asian American movement or the kind of the coining of the Asian American identity had anything to do with the Black Power movement, right? Especially this kind of like the history of African Americans in the United States is not something that we might kind of think of as in conjunction with Asian American identity. So why is that? So I have two kind of possibilities for kind of complicating this. But before I go into it, I'll ask another question. How many of you are familiar with the concept of the model minority? Many of us, all of us. So the model minority is a stereotype and it's a myth, right? It's a stereotype and it's a myth. And it says that basically Asian Americans work hard, Asian Americans are quiet, Asian Americans don't ask for government handouts, and most perniciously of all, if Asian Americans can succeed and work hard and do well and make it in the U.S. society, all racial minorities should be able to achieve the same. That is the model minority myth, right? That Asians are sort of this like model that other minorities should kind of follow. So, as with all stereotypes, many people think, oh yeah, stereotypes, they're based on a grain of truth. But as with all stereotypes, this stereotype also has a specific historical origin, which was, let's see, this was the term model minority was coined by a sociologist, a UC Berkeley sociologist named William Peterson, who wrote an article in 1966 talking about how Japanese Americans, despite the discrimination and racism they faced, especially during World War II, have come back, made no complaints, and went away quietly and worked really hard, and now they've kind of out-succeeded the whites. So this was why he kind of called them the model minority. Later that year, in 1966, another article was published that now talked about the Chinese Americans this time. And it said the Chinese Americans are also very, hardworking, they're like family-oriented, and so they are able to succeed. Something to keep in mind about these two articles and this coining of the racial model minority myth is their distinctive anti-blackness that we see in these two articles, where they single out Black people as a point of contrast to the model minority. So one of the articles actually said, we didn't put Black people in a concentration camp. Japanese Americans have suffered the most racism in the United States, and look what they did. Look what they were able to accomplish, right? Completely erasing the history of slavery in the United States and the ongoing anti-Black violence in the United States, right? So this is something kind of important to keep in mind about this stereotype. Some people think that it's a positive stereotype because okay, it's a compliment that Asians are hardworking, Asians are smart, right? But it has a really kind of insidious origin as a point of contrast. That's something that everybody should model after. And many or some Asians actually kind of buy into this, right? Like, if I work hard, if I work hard and I made it through my own success and hard work, and why can't other people, right? Why can't other people of color do the same? Why can't other minorities do the same? Not accounting for the structural inequalities that exist, right? Why we need something like Black Lives Matter today? Why that utterance is even something that's like imaginable and thinkable today and necessary. So another complication to why we might not readily think about this radical past that Asian Americans have in the United States is the question that I started out with earlier about why many of us don't have ancestors in the United States before 1968. This is the result of the 1965 Immigration Act. So I told you about the 1924 Immigration Act that was racist and that really kind of barred Asians from entering the country. 1965 Immigration Act overturned that racist act. So after 1965, immigration was no longer based on this like racist quota system, but instead it was more it prioritized family reunification, and it prioritized kind of professionals who could enter the country. And many Asians today living in the United States have entered the country after the 1965 Immigration Act. So most Asian Americans are either immigrants themselves or are children of immigrants. So this is why we need to educate ourselves and why we need Asian American studies, why we need Asian American literature classes, why we need Asian American history classes, because we don't have grandparents, parents, aunties, uncles. We don't have people who lived through the history of the 60s. Not all of us, some of us do, but we don't have these like family members to remind us, this is what I went through, this is what we went through. Many of us are children of immigrants or are immigrants ourselves. And if we leave it to the university is not going to kind of like, stay up overnight and thinking, how can we educate people of color? How can we teach them their own history? How can we teach them, a different narrative of history than this like dominant narrative, right? Based on like Revolutionary War and like Christopher Columbus. And, we need our own narrative of history and we need our own knowledge. Basically, what the activists of the 1960s were asking for. They said, we need to get control of our own knowledge. So, we need to reclaim our history, we need to reclaim our narrative, and also something I want to kind of conclude on is to kind of really advocate for thinking coalitionally. We need to think coalitionally, and we need to kind of think about this coalitional past. And what does it mean to think coalitionally? And I really like what Yuri Kochiyama said about don't think about joining an organization, but think about issues, right? And these are some numbers of Asian American population after 1965. But like this activist group, for example, right? Like Asians for Black Lives Matter. So I don't think, coalition means kind of thinking and comparing Asian American experience to the Black experience and kind of thinking that the two are commensurable, right? They're not. They're very different histories and they're very different issues. But this does not mean that, just because we ourselves are not Black doesn't mean that we can't participate in fights for justice, for movements like Black Lives Matter. There is certainly anti-Asian racism in the United States, but I think that all of us could be also open to the very fact that Black lives continue to be in peril in the United States today. So I want to conclude by mentioning a Black queer poet, Audre Lorde. I'm an English professor, so I like to end with literature. So Audre Lorde said, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. And I think that what Lily said about getting involved and letting our voices heard is really true. Activism is hard work. It is hard to speak against power. But if we don't do it, then nobody else is going to do it. The power is not going to change without people speaking up against power. Also, Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. She also said that there is no hierarchy of oppressions, right? Some people nowadays call it like the oppression Olympics, about like who suffered the most in the United States, which people of color have suffered the most in the United States. I think if we get in the mindset of what Yuri Kochiyama said about focusing on the issues, that kind of oppression hierarchy like makes no sense, right? We need to tackle the issues at hand. We need to kind of look to the ways in which the power, those in power kind of divide and conquer, right? And kind of make impossible the idea of coalitional thinking. So I want to leave you with a question, which is, what happens when we forget this history that I just went over? What happens when we don't remember this coalitional past and this kind of radical history of what it means to be Asian American? Who wins? Who loses, and what will we be losing? So that's my last question. Thank you, everyone, for listening.